Imagine this. The sealed catacombs under Paris are opened at last, and every mummy is gone. Not stolen, not dragged, simply gone. What's left is a trembling layer of golden pollen, as if someone had shaken petals off a flower the size of a house. And in the far corridor, a solid stone wall has softened like warm wax and pulled itself apart, revealing a tunnel that no map ever recorded. A warm, living breath drifts from the darkness, almost curious, almost hungry. Because whatever was down there has already climbed to the surface, and it's collecting a new kind of specimen, the ones that still breathe. The collapse of the ancient walls of the Cemetery of the Innocents began as a faint groan beneath the clamor of a city stepping into a new century, yet the sound carried something more than the complaints of old stone. It slid through the narrow streets of Paris like a premonition, stirring dust that had slept through countless winters. When the earth finally split and revealed what lay beneath, the workers froze, sensing instantly that this discovery was not merely archaeological but intruded into a realm that should have remained sealed. Under the damp soil, a corridor stretched in a deceptive calm, winding like the hidden root of an immense, long-dead tree. Its stillness felt deliberate, almost tended, as if this subterranean passage had been waiting to exhale its secret. Within its dim recesses lay bodies arranged with a precision that denied haste or neglect. They were dried to the fragility of pressed flowers, each limb flattened into a brittle elegance. Skin crumbled into pale dust at the slightest brush of air, scattering like petals from a forgotten herbarium. Their mouths, impossibly contorted, were filled to the brim with withered roses, the stems inserted carefully, reverently, as though someone believed that the dead could still breathe in the memory of their scent. A sweetness lingered around them, faint but unmistakable, the faded echo of long-vanished gardens. Yet the true disturbance lay deeper. In one stone sarcophagus, the workers saw a shimmer, a bead of warm moisture trembling on the desiccated chest of the corpse. It glistened as though freshly formed, as though the body had drawn a breath not moments but heartbeats ago. The touch of that fragile droplet on the stagnant air fractured whatever sense of safety remained. It was not rainwater, nor condensation. It held a living warmth that no lifeless vault should have possessed. As lanterns flickered and shadows rippled across the corridor walls, an unease seeped upward from the earth, spreading through Paris like a slow and sourceless draft. People above felt it without knowing why. Horses balked on cobblestones for no visible reason. Bakers rising before dawn swore they caught the perfume of crushed blossoms drifting through shuttered windows. Even the river seemed to murmur differently, as though it had been asked to carry a secret it did not want. Something had crossed a boundary the city had never consented to open. The discovery beneath the Cemetery of the Innocents was not a relic of the past, but a sign of something ongoing, patient, and attentive. Paris sensed, with a quiver that no language could quite articulate, that an unseen hand had stirred, gently but decisively, in the quiet place where the living had once believed silence was absolute. News of the discovery spread across Paris with a swiftness that defied any wind sweeping the quays, threading itself through conversations, markets, and doorways until it no longer felt like rumor but a presence with its own quiet pulse. It moved in ways that eluded understanding, slipping into bakeries before dawn, lingering in the cold corners of stairwells, brushing past the shoulders of those who wandered home late. In every arrondissement, people began to notice a scent that did not belong to the season, a faint dusting of pollen, warm and sweet, settling where it had no reason to appear. The old apartment blocks that leaned toward one another like tired giants now housed this strange fragrance in their dim staircases, as though someone had walked each landing with hands full of withered blossoms. In narrow alleys between cramped shops, the air held the same elusive sweetness. Merchants stepping out to close their shutters found thin yellow grains on their fingertips, clinging with a persistence that felt almost intentional. Near the confectioner's stalls, where rose-flavored treats had always been a harmless indulgence, the scent shifted into something heavier, more compelling, as if the candies themselves exhaled a fragrance borrowed from some hidden garden. It made customers pause, uncertain whether they were being enticed or warned. At the early morning markets, where fishmongers and vegetable sellers relied on brisk air to keep their wares fresh, a thin veil of pollen appeared on the wooden tables and woven baskets long before sunrise. Vendors brushed it away with uneasy swipes, only to find it had settled again moments later, as though it were being sifted down from an unseen branch high above. The dust did not irritate the skin or eyes. Instead, it carried a warmth that stirred discomfort precisely because it seemed benign. It belonged to plants that did not grow in the city, to flowers that had no place in the narrow geometry of Parisian streets. Even the night watchmen, hardened by years of patrolling the desolate grounds around the cemetery of the innocents, felt the intrusion. Their uniforms bore stray petals and soft reds and yellows, delicate fragments that curled inward as though they had been plucked from a dying bloom. None of the men remembered brushing against anything that could have shed them, and the petals' edges were crisp, too dry to have been carried by the damp night air. They were placed, not blown. Whispers bloomed alongside the pollen. Conversations lowered themselves to hushed tones as residents recalled the dried bodies beneath the earth, their mouths filled with roses, their rib cages dusted with fresh golden grains. A name emerged, forming itself without agreement, growing like moss on stone, the collector. Not spoken with certainty, but with inevitability, as though the city had always known that someone moved through its shadows with the patience of a gardener tending a withered orchard. People imagined gloved hands arranging brittle limbs, a meticulous devotion that reached far beyond simple obsession. And as the pollen continued to appear where no flowers grew, Paris felt the slow tightening of a presence that was neither ghost nor man, but something that cherished the dead with an intimacy unsettlingly close to love. The workers who descended once more into the corridor felt at first only the familiar dampness, the stale chill that coiled through the underground air like an old habit. Their lanterns carved trembling slices of gold across the stone, but the light seemed weaker than before, as though reluctant to intrude on what had begun to take shape below the surface. When they reached the chamber of the dried bodies, they froze in an unease that no words could soften. Something had changed, not abruptly, not violently, but with the slow precision of hands that labored in the dark with unwavering patience. The corpses no longer looked as they had during the first discovery. Their forms appeared subtly altered, smoothed, as if some unseen caretaker had wiped each hollow limb with a damp cloth, coaxing from the leathery skin a sheen that defied its age. The lantern light caught the ribs of the nearest mummy, and there, unmistakably, lay delicate trails of golden pollen, fresh enough to glimmer. These were not remnants of disturbed dust nor the residue of ancient flowers disintegrating into nothingness. They were vibrant, recent, arranged with such gentleness that the workers felt intruders merely by looking at them. As they stepped further into the chamber, a soft crunch sounded beneath their boots. A thin, even layer of pollen coated the floor, settling over uneven stones with the uniformity of snow. It did not drift in tiny clouds when disturbed. Instead, it shifted sluggishly, almost with reluctance, as though it had weight and intention. On the walls, new markings had appeared. They were not scratches from tools or weathering from time. They curved in graceful arcs, branching into delicate bifurcations that resembled the trails left by something brushing repeatedly against the stone. The shapes were neither human nor animal. Their geometry belonged to something else entirely, something that did not crawl nor walk, but glided or swayed. The arcs suggested flexibility, softness, yet their repeated presence spoke of tenacity. They looked like impressions left by petals, petals large enough to leave a mark, firm enough to resist crumbling, alive enough to press with purpose. The workers felt the unsettling sense that the walls themselves had been touched, stroked, or momentarily embraced. As the group moved deeper into the corridor, the air thickened, not with dust, though particles shimmered faintly, nor with moisture, though droplets clung to the cold surfaces like tiny breaths. It thickened with a sensation impossible to articulate, a heaviness that suggested a presence expanding and contracting with each human step. The underground space seemed to inhale when they exhaled, to tense when they shifted their weight, to listen with attention so focused it bordered on hunger. The faint warmth rising from the pollen against their boots was wrong, unnatural for a place deprived of sunlight and living roots for so many centuries. The workers exchanged glances filled with quiet dread. They tried to tell themselves that the changes could be explained. Shifts in air currents, settling stone, their own imaginations stirred by rumors spreading through Paris like wildfire. But imagination could not account for the subtle gloss on the mummified limbs, nor for the precise arrangement of golden dust along the ribs, nor for the unmistakable freshness of something that had no right to be fresh. Retreating toward the entrance, they felt the corridor narrowing not physically but perceptually, as though the very passageway resented their departure. Some swore they felt a faint brushing on their wrists or necks, too gentle to be alarming, yet too deliberate to dismiss as mere drafts. Others insisted that the floor pulsed beneath their soles with a faint rhythm, like the heartbeat of something vast and buried. Meanwhile, above ground, Paris grew restless without understanding why. The city's mood shifted with the subtlety of evening entering morning, unnoticed in the moment, obvious only in hindsight. Warm gusts of scented air swept through windows sealed against the night. Apothecaries found their jars coated in a film of yellow that reappeared even after thorough cleaning. Children complained of phantom tickles along their arms, as though brushed by unseen fronds. Dogs refused to approach drains or cellar doors, growling at nothing the eye could perceive. The presence was no longer confined to one forgotten corridor. It seeped, patient and undeterred, into the soil and the breath of the city. What the workers had sensed, the awareness, the responsiveness, was not a momentary disturbance but the stirring of something whose artistry required death as its medium. Something that regarded the human body the way a sculptor regards stone or a gardener regards earth. Something that had waited beneath Paris for longer than any living soul, shaping its quiet dominion petal by petal, corpse by corpse, until at last the city trembled with the recognition that it was no longer alone in its own depths. At night the city seemed to shrink into itself, drawing its breath in long, tense intervals, as if unsure whether exhaling might invite something closer. The houses, usually so resolute in their stone and timber, gave soft, strained creaks, the kind produced by stems bending under a wind that had not yet arrived but was already anticipated. Roof tiles shifted with faint, brittle sounds, suggesting that the structures were preparing for pressure from above, or perhaps reacting to something that had already passed silently overhead. Paris, a city accustomed to nocturnal restlessness, now lay awake under a different kind of tension, one that belonged not to revelry or crime, but to a quiet, deliberate intrusion. It began on the rooftops. Tenants emerging at dawn to air linens or check the gutters found fragile constructions assembled from dried twigs, human-shaped outlines arranged with meticulous intent. These fragile figures lay crouched or sprawled or curled, as though frozen mid-motion. The twigs snapped at the slightest touch, yet their forms were unmistakable, rib cages suggested by careful lattices, limbs implied by branching stems, skulls rendered as delicate ovals woven tightly together. No wind could have crafted them. Their placement was too precise, their proportions too uncanny, their presence too intrusive. They appeared on lofts, above stairwells, on the slanted roofs of bakeries, even atop chimneys where no human feet could reasonably balance. Sometimes, just before sunrise, dried flower heads drifted to the streets below. They did not fall in gusts, for the air remained unervingly still. Rather, they descended one by one, spinning slowly, like discarded thoughts. Their petals were crisp, curled inward, and eerily intact, as if they had been plucked moments earlier from a bloom that had never known life. They scattered across the cobblestones in a morbid imitation of confetti, settling in doorways, sinking into the uneven mortar between stones, collecting in the grooves of carriage wheels. The city cleaners swept them away by the handful, but by the next morning the petals returned, no matter how thoroughly the streets had been cleared. In the narrowest alleys, where sunlight rarely lingered long enough to warm the air, a soft whispering sound began to accompany the nights. It was barely audible, easily mistaken for the rustle of fabric or the scuttle of a rat. Yet those who paused to listen felt a shiver crawl up their arms. The noise was organic, but not animal, floral, but not tender. It resembled the heavy, deliberate peeling of petals from a bud, or the slow unfolding of something dense and fleshy. The sound carried a feeling rather than a message, an impression of effort, of deliberate labor, of something working with immense care under the cover of night. Few dared traverse Paris after the city had fully surrendered to darkness. Those who did reported a sensation that clung to them with unnerving precision. Footsteps that should have echoed in solitude felt accompanied, shadowed by something that adjusted its pace to match their own. There was no visible pursuit, no figure slipping between doorways or darting behind carts. Instead, a strange pressure seemed to accumulate in the air behind them, a soft insistence that grew heavier with each step. Some said they felt the faintest brush on their sleeves, the whisper of a touch along their spine, like the stroke of a petal pulled tenderly across the skin. The most unnerving feeling was the sense of creation occurring in their wake. It was as if invisible threads stretched behind them, and along those threads, something placed petal after petal with a craftsman's devotion. Every stride became a cue for assembly, every shift in weight an invitation for the unseen to add another fragile piece to an expanding structure. It was not malicious, not an intention, but there was an obsessive quality in it, an artistry that cared nothing for the living except as mechanisms to guide its craft. Paris began to understand that the presence moving through its streets was not simply haunting them. It was building, always building, constructing shapes on roofs, shedding dried blossoms from unseen heights, weaving unseen outlines step by step behind those who braved the darkness. The city trembled under the realization that it was being slowly transformed into a workshop, one where the materials were old wood, dead petals, and the faint echoes of human movement, and where the artist remained hidden but utterly unrelenting. The corridors beneath the cemetery had been sealed with stone, iron, and a determination born of fear, yet nothing in Paris truly believed that such barriers could halt what had begun to move through the city like a slow, fragrant tide. Closing the passageways only severed the visible entrance. It did not suffocate the influence that had already seeped into the soil, the walls, the breath of the living. Above ground, in the oldest quarters where centuries layered themselves like dust on forgotten shelves, the first bodies appeared with a quiet inevitability. They were found in places that suggested no struggle, arranged with unsettling composure, as though they had simply paused to rest and never resumed rising. None of the bodies bore marks of violence. Their faces retained the softness of sleep, lips relaxed, brows unknotted, as though death had selected them gently, with the same care one might use when choosing a blossom past its prime. Yet their skin told a different story. It was drawn tight and pale, the color of parchment left too long in the sun. At a touch, it held a brittle firmness, not wholly lifeless, but altered, transformed into something like the husk of a flower preserved beyond its season. Their fingertips curled inward as though responding to an unseen lullaby, and their limbs, though unmoving, seemed arranged by a hand that valued symmetry above all else. On the chest of each body lay a single flower. These blooms did not belong to the gardens of Paris. No botanist recognized them. No catalogue of flora recorded their shape. The petals were elongated, almost translucent, with delicate veins that shimmered faintly under lamplight. Their tones ranged from deep umber to pale violet, hues that felt foreign to the city's more familiar palette of roses and violets. What unsettled the onlookers most was the moisture binding the petals together, a warm, viscous dew that felt not like water but like breath condensed into liquid. When touched, it pulsed faintly, as though trying to cling to the skin of the living. Around each body lingered a sweetness so dense it seemed to weigh on the lungs. It was not the rot of decay nor the perfume of fresh flowers. Rather, it carried the strange warmth of something in the midst of transformation, as if the air itself were attempting to repair the flesh, coaxing it back toward some unknown ideal. Those who discovered the bodies recoiled instinctively, not from horror but from the cloying pressure of that atmosphere, which pressed against them with a tenderness that felt invasive, almost pleading. As nights lengthened and temperatures dipped, thin trails of pollen began to appear across the city's stone surfaces. These trails formed delicate, almost deliberate paths across bridges, down narrow staircases, and along the abandoned courtyards where no footsteps had echoed for years. At first, the residents dismissed them as residue blown in from some distant countryside, yet the paths followed patterns too clear to be accidental. They wove toward forgotten places, courtyards choked with ivy, gardens that had long ago surrendered to cobblestone, terraces where once, in the distant past, flowers had bloomed in abundance. Under moonlight, the trails seemed to glow faintly, guiding anyone who dared follow them into pockets of the city where silence felt thick enough to drink. Some claimed they saw movements in those deserted yards, not figures, but slow ripples across the air, as though something vast and petal-like brushed through the space. Cats refused to follow the paths. Dogs pulled their owners in the opposite direction with frantic insistence. Bodies continued to appear, always peaceful, always adorned with a flower not meant for Parisian soil. And with each new discovery, the pollen paths grew denser, more intertwined, spreading like veins across the city. It became clear that sealing the corridors beneath the cemetery had not contained the influence that lived there. Whatever had tended the dead in the darkness now tended the living above with equal devotion, shaping them into specimens for a garden the city had never agreed to host. Paris, once proud of its cultivated beauty, now felt itself becoming the canvas of an artist whose vision required silence, transformation, and a patience older than the stones beneath its feet. The city's decision came as a final, desperate consensus whispered through the council halls just before dawn. If the sealed corridors beneath the old graveyard continued to exhale their strange warmth, if the transformations above ground persisted, then every locked passageway of the catacombs had to be opened at once. It was not an act of courage so much as surrender to necessity. Paris could no longer afford to behave like a patient hoping a fever might pass on its own. By the time the first teams descended in a staggered procession, the sky above the rooftops was still the color of cooled ash, and the air carried that faint sweetness that for weeks had crept through the boulevards like a memory no one wanted to acknowledge. They entered expecting a lair. A creature, a man, something with a face that could be looked at and blamed. But the catacombs greeted them with nothing more than their own breathing. The walls stood pale and sweating as though someone had pressed warm cloths against the stone and withdrawn them only moments before. Shelves that once held rows of withered bodies were bare. Every desiccated husk that had so horrified the first explorers was gone. Lifted, perhaps, carried, none could tell, for there were no drag marks, no traces of violence. It was as if the dead had stepped away of their own accord. On the floor lay a dense layer of golden dust. It quivered faintly when touched by the lantern glow, as if each grain trembled with some inner pulse. The men tried to brush it aside, only to find that it clung to their boots with the persistence of pollen freshly released from a flower too large to imagine. The further they walked, the thicker the film became, until their steps sounded unnervingly soft, muffled, like movement on a forest floor blanketed by petals. The discovery came only when they reached the far corridor, one that, according to all maps dating back to the early centuries, should have ended in a sealed wall. The wall was still there, in a sense, but it no longer possessed any firmness of form. It sagged inward, bulging like clay that had been warmed by hands. Long vertical seams ran through it, as though something had pressed fingers, many, many fingers, into its surface and pulled gently, coaxing it apart with patient strength. And between these softened folds, a passage yawned. It was not cold like the rest of the catacombs. A faint, slow draft brushed across their faces, carrying with it the scent of something green and living, a scent unfamiliar to Parisian air. It was warm, almost intimate, like the breath of a creature sleeping in the darkness ahead. When the lanterns illuminated the newly formed tunnel, its walls appeared smoother, darker, almost elastic, as if they had been shaped not by tools but by growth. No human hand could have carved such curves. One of the men knelt and touched the floor, His fingers came away coated in a thick smear of pollen, warm as skin. He recoiled, wiping his hand against his coat, but the dust clung stubbornly, shimmering faintly under the more intense light. Another man leaned forward and listened. He said he heard breathing, slow, rhythmic, impossibly deep. The others insisted it was only the echo of their lantern flames. They all knew they were lying. And then realization, quiet but merciless, swept through them like a blade of cold wind. Whatever had been using these passages, it was no longer here. It had already left. They emerged onto the surface shaken, their lanterns dimming as if even the light wished to retreat. By then Paris had already sensed the truth in its own way. The strange scents drifting through the streets, the delicate figures woven from twigs on the rooftops, the bodies found with their skin dried to paper and their chests crowned with impossible flowers. These had not been the preludes to an arrival. They had been the consequences of a departure. The catacombs had not hidden the collector. They had incubated his work, sheltered it, nurtured it like a greenhouse nestled beneath the city's stones. And while citizens slept behind shuttered windows and priests prayed over closed doors, he had risen to the surface to continue what the underground could no longer provide. Above ground, the air felt wrong, too warm, too alive. The breeze carried a drifting trail of pollen, and when it touched a lamppost, it clung like affectionate dust, glimmering faintly. Somewhere in the maze of streets, something stirred with quiet purpose, gathering its harvest one breath at a time. Paris understood now, but far too late. The collector desired only what still breathed, and the city, vast as it was, offered an endless supply.